Here's how you can become a better interviewer on your podcast.
Mate, that is a bloody good question. I've actually never been asked that question in that way. It's a good question, mate.
It's a really good question.
It's a good question, a really good question.
Yeah, that's a good question. Good question. This is a good question.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, good question. That's a really good question.
Yep, good question.
Although I am new to the podcasting game, I've already had a lot of very good feedback about the style of conversation and the questions that I ask on my podcast, The Main Journey. So the first thing is actually completing a pre-podcast questionnaire. On this questionnaire, I am asking my guests to share with me the topics they would love to talk about and also the topics they would not like to talk about. This gives me an insight into their expertise, but also what they're passionate about as well. When someone is an expert in a topic or they're passionate for it, that is going to come across in the conversations that you have. Once I know their expertise and their passions, I can now start to prepare questions that I'm going to ask on that podcast. More on this to come, but before I even start the podcast, I am going to heavily stalk my guest. I'm going to go on all of their different socials. I'm going to read their posts. I'm going to listen to their podcasts. I'm going to watch their videos. And I'm ultimately trying to learn as much as I can about my guests before they even get onto my show. This approach isn't for everyone because I know a lot of people like to almost have a clean slate when they're recording a podcast. However, I want to save time and I want to get right into the juicy content. And that comes from knowing this individual better than if it was a clean slate. That's my personal opinion. So before I even start my podcast, I create a dossier of all of the details about my guest. I'll have all of their videos, their podcasts, their website, different posts. And again, I'll learn as much as I can about this guest before I even hit record. Then when I have this dossier created and I've now got a lot of information about the podcast guest, this allows me to go ahead and start to create questions I'd like to ask on my podcast. Now, when I am making these questions, what I am actually thinking about is what is going to be good hooks for YouTube videos. Also, I'm thinking about what would I actually like to learn from this person and how can I allow them to share their expertise on certain topics. My goal is to prepare around 20 or so questions that I could potentially use on the podcast recording. To note, I more than likely will not ask this many questions, but I like to have these tools in my tool belt in case I need to use them. On top of this, I also prepare my introduction to the podcast and I actually pre-warn my guest what the first question is going to be. This allows for a seamless transition of starting that podcast and to make sure that we can go straight into some really good content from the very start and keep my listeners hooked. Then when I'm recording my podcast, I have a notepad next to me and I'm frantically taking notes. And what I'm aiming to do is to link the conversation to the questions that I have already prepared. I do not want to sit there and have like a scripted interview where it's just question after question after question and there's no flow to the conversation. I want to be able to link the topic that the guest is talking about to those questions I've already prepared. And this allows me to ask truly valuable questions and it still stays in flow. I can only do this because of the preparation that I've done. And I'm ultimately just copying and pasting these questions, but being able to carry on the conversation. Something that has always helped me is to always be one question ahead of my guest. Therefore, whenever it comes to me to talk, I already have a question lined up that I want to ask them. I then don't have to sit there and panic about what I'm going to ask them next. I've already got that lined up. And again, my goal is to link this to the conversation we're already having so that it's a seamless flow. On top of this, I also want to be genuinely intrigued and curious about the topics that my guest is talking about. This leads to the best questions. So often I may go completely off script from the questions I've prepared, and I want to be able to continue that valuable conversation that we're already having. This only works if you are genuinely intrigued and curious about the topic that they are sharing. Something that I am aiming to improve on is to actually challenge my guests more and accept that it's okay for me to disagree with their point of view. But for the listener, it's incredibly valuable to hear differences of opinion in a healthy way. So for that to happen, you have to have the courage to challenge your guest and to step up if you disagree with a statement. And this allows you to have a healthy conversation and see these 2 points of view. The flip side of having courage to challenge your guests is that you may also have to accept that you may be in the wrong. So there is 2 sides to this coin. Another way for you to become a better interviewer for your podcast is to have repeatable questions that you ask every single guest that comes onto your show. For me, I ask every guest, what advice would your future self give you in this current moment? It's a super powerful question that really challenges the guest. And I think this gives incredible value to the listener, whilst also creating consistency between every single episode. And the final point here is to always ask for constructive feedback. This has allowed me to drastically improve my podcast from episode 1 to where I'm at now. So to conclude this video, there is a few major points I want you to take away. Number 1 is that preparation is key. Number 2 is you want to understand what is your guest's expertise and what are their passions so that you can talk about those on your show. Number 3 is to always be one question ahead of your guest. Number 4 is to be curious, be genuine, and have fun. And number 5 is to subscribe to the channel so that you never miss an episode of the Main Journey podcast. I truly hope you have gained value from today's video. And if you have subscribed, I massively appreciate you, and I'll see you tomorrow.